So, good morning, everyone, and good evening to the folks who have logged in from other time zones. My name is Divyansh, and I'm your host for the session today. My startup equity in association with Inventus Law are feel glad to present this conference on one of the most requested topics that was coming in from our ecosystem, which was incorporating in the US what it takes. To begin with, I would like to introduce our speakers for the day, starting from Anil Advani, who's founder and managing partner of Inventus Law. Anil is a startup lawyer who has been practicing law in Silicon Valley for last 21 years and is a leading expert in structuring US-India investment structures. Anil has represented more than 3,000 startups in transactions worth more than $3.5 billion in the aggregate. So, hi Anil, welcome to the panel today.
Hi, Divyansh. Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Sanjay Jha, who's co-founder, CPO, and CTO of Let's Venture and My Startup Equity, super geek, innovator, and tech leader. Sanjay is a product guy at the heart who loves to code and explore new technologies. He's a true growth enabler with over 2.5 decades of experience. His expertise lies in developing software products, strong tech teams, leadership for high performance innovation, for better efficiency and qualities. And he is going to talk about equity management today to us. So, with that being said, I would like to give the ball to Anil, and stage is all yours, Anil. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Divyansh. So this is the introductory slide. I'll keep flipping through the slides. I understand I have around 30 minutes, so I'll try to make the most out of those 30 minutes and cover as much ground as I can. I also understand we have some, time at the end for Q&A. So I'd like to keep more time because if people have questions after the presentation, it's always good to get into that interactive mode to the extent we can. I assume, Divyansh, that you'll be moderating those questions. So without further ado, and I want to leave some time for Sanjay as the host and let him talk about all the great stuff they're doing at My Startup Equity and Let's Venture. So I'll get started and sort of flow through the slides as quickly, as efficiently as possible, pausing where I think it's important for people to pay attention to certain items and issues that come up fairly often. And then sort of we'll see sort of, how that goes in terms of timing. And Divyansh, let me know if, wherever you think if we might be going over time
Sure,
because
Anil.
we have ground to cover.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
So as you said, it's a pretty often, very often sort of asked question. We get, on average, one new company a day from India. I probably speak to more than one company a day, but one new client a day that's looking for flipping their existing India company or existing India structure over to the US. Why they're doing it. I mean, there are a number of reasons. I've tried to outline the ones that, based on our conversation, our experience, are the most likely, most applicable. But there could be other personal reasons as well. Sometimes founders are moving, or there's personal reasons for them to be looking to do other things. But the most important, obviously, is to be able to access global markets. If you are and we'll go into it, but if you are any sort of technology company, your market is global. Sitting in India is not going to cut it, right? I mean, there are good companies, not to say there are not. I mean, but it's just more difficult to build a global tech company. Again, I say tech in the sense of deep tech, SaaS, enterprise, where your customers are sitting in the US or Europe or Singapore, Australia, wherever they may be, but mostly in the US to start with. And you're sitting trying to build it as an India company. It's just very challenging. And many folks, when I have these discussions, when we used to have these discussions in person, they would say, "Oh, no, that's not true," and we would get into these debates and arguments. I would just say, "I don't need to debate. You don't need to debate. I'm just sharing my experience, right?" So if you're sitting in India trying to build a global tech company, you need to very strongly consider setting up an US operations and US holding company because that's where your customers will require. They may not require on day one. If you're selling to the smaller, the small businesses, maybe you don't need that. But as you scale, selling to larger enterprise SaaS businesses, you will need to be, and that's something that plays out over a period of time. So if you're again sitting in India as an Indian founder, saying to yourself or your advisors, angels are telling you, don't worry, you can be, sure, do that. 2 years later, we'll be having this discussion. Invariably, founders I speak with come back in a year or 2 years. Half of them get it and we start from day one. Half of them don't get it. And 2 years later, they say, I wish I'd done it 2 years earlier. And it just becomes more painful. So reason number one is you have the ability to access global markets, customers. The second, obviously equally important reason you would do it is you want to be able to access global capital. And you like it or not, but investors, especially in US and particularly in Silicon Valley, or even private equity for sure in US and global markets, they're sort of wary of investing in India directly in Indian companies. And it's not to say, Flipkart and Paytm, all these companies have raised money from US investors or global investors, Chinese, Asian investors. But again, those are consumer facing businesses, right? And we'll talk about which one, where you are, and how to analyze that. But if you're looking as again as an enterprise tech company, if you're looking to access global capital, you will invariably require to set up a Delaware corporation. What that does is also provides you, and these are the other reasons, right? It provides you a Delaware corporation that's basically no one's ever going to ask you why are you a Delaware corporation, right? You will smell like, walk like, talk like any of the trillion-dollar companies: Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, you name it, they're all Delaware corporations, right? So if you are going to be successful, if you aspire to be successful company, you look at what successful companies have done. Invariably, you will find the companies you like want to become are Delaware corporations. The reason they are good Delaware corporations are because Delaware has very clear and transparent rules for not just U.S. companies, U.S. founders, for global, coming in and out. The laws relating to IP ownership, investments, moving money in and out, the taxes that apply, contractual rights. That Delaware was the first state in the union in the U.S., and therefore it has the most sort of developed body of corporate laws. Courts even in California cite Delaware courts. So Delaware is a big sort of driver magnet for corporations across the globe, including obviously U.S. corporations, but across the globe, and increasingly Indian corporations to set up in Delaware as Delaware holding companies. If you're a Delaware corporation, again, invariably, if you're trying to hire global talent, a key employee or advisor, developer, CTO, CFO, CMO, whoever it is in Silicon Valley, in US, across the world, invariably they would have had or worked with other Delaware corporations. So when they get options or stock, and Sanjay will get into some of the technicalities, but once they get stock or options or any equity, any rights, they're if they've done this before, if they've been part of successful startups, they would be used to getting a piece of paper with Delaware shares and the way it's structured terminology. And it'd be much easier for you to be able to hire and incentivize these people with documentation structures that they're familiar with, right? So that's again, you're just making it very simple to be able to execute on your larger goals. And then as you build the business, and I've seen this all the time, your access to global exit options, IPOs. Obviously, there's no bigger market than the U.S. public markets, but SPACs have taken off, and that again, unique instrument where you're just starting to get into the rhythm where you could be a Series B or Series C company, and you may have 5 years before you can actually get an exit. But suddenly, SPACs open up the opportunity of merging or creating a bigger entity and exiting. And as founders, that's a very attractive option that you should not take lightly, especially if you're at that stage. So, and you can only do that again as a Delaware corporation or a US corporation, but invariably a Delaware corporation. And most importantly, which the one that applies in most cases is the ability to sell. If you are a Series B, Series C funded company and you don't have the legs to go all the way IPO, or there's a strategic opportunity to sell for $1 billion, again, invariably it's going to be a large tech company based in the US that will buy. And when they make that offer, they would just assume you're a Delaware corporation. If it goes up the channel, we do this all the time. The general counsels, legal diligence, tax diligence, structure diligence, either they'll not do the deal, or they'll require you to flip into a Delaware corporation, or they will take 6 extra months to complete the deal because they'll just not be familiar with anything else. So again, you're putting roadblocks against yourselves, against your own success to the exit, because that should be always the path when you're starting, right? How do you get to the exit? So remove all the roadblocks as much as you can. If that's your path to build a successful global tech firm, and become, sort of just follow what other successful companies are doing. Again, I want to make sure that everyone understands, because this is an important topic. People ask it, and as I said, 10 years ago when I started doing a lot of the India US, a lot of founders would have these discussions. We get into debate. Most of them would go away either because of lethargy or getting other advisors, whoever they talk to, or their own decisions. They didn't incorporate or reflip into US. And again, when they were raising money, they had to access capital. They had an acquisition offer. they would come running back and say, how do we do this? And it would take us 3 months extra. And they would say, shoot, I should have, listened to you when you were saying it on day one. So think about, these are good reasons. If any of these reasons apply to you, then you should be thinking about how US India holding structure, India US holding structure from day one. As I was trying to allude to, the best time to do it is when you're starting out, because if you raise money in an India company, if you've been filing taxes, if you have patents, customers in an India company, then flipping it into a US holding company becomes very complicated. It's good for us. We'll just charge you more to do the work, but it's not good for you. And we frankly don't want to charge for work that's not adding any value that could have been avoided if you've done this properly on day one. But again, we've worked with companies that have raised multiple rounds of funding that have significant revenues. It's just more complicated, requires more deliberation than if you start from day one. So as a founder, it behoves you to sit back and think about what is your plan. If the plan is to work with global customers, access global capital, sell to a larger global company or go IPO in the US, then start thinking about being a US holding company and that US India structure from very early on. Again, if you are, on the other hand, if you're a consumer business, 100% consumer, I used to say when I started talking about this, if you're a Shadi.com, if your market is in India, now Shadi.com is global and their market is, I guess, NRIs across the world. But you understand, right? The consumers in India, if you're selling to a consumer in India, if you are a Flipkart, for example, you're a e-commerce company and your market is Indian consumers, then absolutely, it may not make sense for you to be a US company. Even though, even in those instances, being a US company will help you access capital, but not necessarily on the customer side, right? So even then, consider US holding company, but it's not as critical to be a US holding company as it is if you're a SaaS enterprise, other sort of tech businesses. I'm not saying consumer and e-commerce is not tech, but it's a different sort of market of tech that you're building. People ask me all the time, why not Singapore? And I ask them, sure, but give me a name of a company in Singapore that you aspire to be. That's become the company that you will be. And I'll give you 10 other names of US companies that will walk to the founders that walked in your shoes, Indian founders, and that have done well. Again, for the same reasons, US investors will not invest in a Singapore company. Or if they do, again, there are lots of roadblocks. They don't understand there's no tax treaty between US and Singapore. So if you're, again, looking to access customers and capital in the US or exit options in the US, creating a Singapore company does not really help you. It just creates another step. Many of our clients, again, when we talk to, they say, no, our investors are saying create in Singapore. They have law firms and accountants 5-7 years ago that built a lot of practices in Singapore. So they started pushing founders to do Singapore, which is fine. But now those founders are realizing that there's no exit options or next level of investments. So they're coming back and saying, we did the painful trek from India to Singapore. Now we have to flip all of that into from Singapore to US. So again, save yourself that problem, all that trouble by thinking about US if you're again talking about tech. Again, if you're 100%, if you are selling juice or some mineral water to Indian customers, being an India company is absolutely fine. You probably investors will also be local investors that understand the market, that can add value, and that will give you the right valuation. So I will spend most of my time on this US India parent structure and then flipping through the last few slides if we have time on the rest of the structures, because this is what I get paid for. So this is what I sell, quote unquote. But this is also what I really believe based on my experience for the last 10 odd years. I've been doing this for 21 years now in the Valley, but last 10 years it's obviously become a lot more. And based on my experience, seeing what works for founders, it's a very easy, I believe this is the slide that everyone should be looking at, or this structure, as we will, in whichever form you want to look at. But you will have a Delaware holding company. The Delaware holding company is where the founders are structured. So even though you're sitting in India, you can get stock in the US company. And we'll talk about, the India implications, FEMA regulations, round tripping regulations. But technically you can, and that's the structure, right? Structurally, you will have stock in the US company. The US company will have a global option plan. So even if your employee sitting in India will be able to get options or stock in the US company through the global option plan. The US company was that's formed will create a subsidiary in India. That subsidiary is where all the India employees, including the founders sitting in India. So the founders will be sitting in India, the team will be sitting in India, they'll be employed by the India entity. So effectively nothing changes for you guys, right? You're still sitting in India, working for the India company. The only thing that's changing is that India company is owned by the US at top. And instead of you holding shares in the India company, you hold shares in the US company, which holds shares in the India company. So operationally, nothing changes. Money comes into US, flows into India. It's used for operating expenses. The India company is doing exactly what it would be doing, other than the fact that we have a sort of holding company in US that holds the shares of the India company. Once we set that up, we'll also put a services agreement so that all the work done in India is assigned to the US as part of a services agreement. Pretty standard, very straightforward, nothing to debate about. And again, if you do it from day one, will get you the clean structure that will allow you to grow and access capital and sort of build your business very, very fast. Um, so that's the structure. And then your investors will come in, your seed angel investors, your VC investors, private equities, A, B, C rounds. They'll all come into the US company. That's where the IP will be. And that's the company you'll end up structuring for an exit, either in the public market or an M&A. So we've talked about all of this. It again, the cool part about all this is that once we set this up, you are like any other startup in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, when people talk to you, investors, when you're pitching to investors, when you're looking to hire key people from across the world, when you're raising capital, when you're working with customers, when you're filing for IP protection, you are like any other. I mean, if you're a transportation mobility company, you're like an Uber Inc. If you are a technology consumer product technology, you're like an Apple Inc. If you are a commerce company, you're like Amazon Inc. So all of those, you'd be exactly like these large corporations that were set up before you that you aspire to be. And when people work with you, when they send you legal documents or you have to explain or sort of discuss your structures, you're like any of these large corporations. No one's going to ask you, again, as I said earlier, no one's going to ask you why are you a delivery company. That will be just a simple check in the box. If you're anything else, there will be questions, reviews, issues on how the tax implications are, various other things. So that's the goal, is to structure into that entity. Uh, as we discussed in the model, you will have the US company will have 100% subsidiary in India. That subsidiary will be involved in development services, and as founders, we'll have discussion with you, the founders, on what are the services provided, because how you structure that, because of Indian regulations, the GST that applies to a different part of services, all of that will be dependent on the services and the type of services provided, and we'll need to be very careful about setting all of this up properly. One key element is that because the US and India are affiliated entities, they also have to be compliant with transfer pricing regulations in India. So what that means is, and you'll hear this all the time, so I just want to flesh it out. What that means is we will have a services agreement, master service agreement, where all the work done in India is assigned to the US. All the IP is owned by the US. In exchange, US is agreeing to pay service fees. And that service fees has to be paid at what is called cost plus. Basically, the concept is that the Indian company is providing services at an arm's length basis. So that Indian company should be charging a markup or a profit. Why would an Indian company provide services to a US if it wasn't making money? So we have to, the accountants in India have to come up with that margin, but it's usually somewhere between 15 to 18%. So it's not complicated. If someone's charging you $5,000, $10,000 to come up with that, run away, because at least in the initial stages of the company, when there's not a whole lot of revenues, it's not complicated to come up with that number. As I said, all the employees sitting in India will be employed by the India company. They will all assign their IP, all the work they're doing, to the India company as employees of the India company. India company, in turn, as part of the service agreement, will transfer the IP to the US. As we've discussed before, we have, I've listed out the advantages. If you are a US parent company, it's very easy, by the way. It's a one-day process to set up a Delaware company. As once you set up the Delaware company, you're recognized worldwide as any other startup. And something very important that people forget. I mean, Delaware laws, when you're working with a Delaware corporation or instrument, issuing convertible notes, issuing safes, issuing preferred stock, it's all been done hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times before. Delaware courts, Delaware laws have all been vetted out, so there's no surprises. Even now when we are doing deals in India, there's usually something or the other. If you're selling shares in India company, or there's an M&A, there's always some tax, some regulatory issue, some ownership, some foreign ownership. The rules would have changed. It's still very complicated, and the perception is just very complicated, right? So again, if you are looking to build a company and you're selling the company at that time, you want to have zero friction, right? From the time you build the company and you need to sell the company, you want to be in a position where, from a legal structuring perspective, from a tax perspective, from an investor relation perspective, from your contractual perspective, everything's pretty straightforward. Even your customer contracts, right? When you're entering into customer contracts, ownership of IP, escrow of IP, what happens if something things go bad? All of those have been done over and over again. We all have expertise in that. There are lots of good lawyers in Silicon Valley that can very easily process these contracts, advise you to how you enter into contracts with customers in India, in the US. Again, if you're working with customers across other jurisdictions or using other laws of other jurisdictions, it's uncertain, right? You're getting into what indemnification, what liabilities apply, don't apply. Those are all you're sort of opening up the door to uncertainty there. um, we've talked about the fact that your ability to raise capital, your ability to work with customers, your ability to exit, all of that becomes very smooth. The only downside, if you will, is, and this is not a downside of a US company. Again, when I started talking about these things, someone would say, oh, how about Singapore? And I would remind them the same applies, laws apply. Singapore is not part of India. So if there are any restrictions in non-India investors, the same regulations, restrictions would apply to Singapore as they apply to US. There are some restrictions. Indian residents cannot and should not buy shares in a non-India company, because if they do, then they have to the funds from the US company cannot be invested back in India. That's called round tripping. Many of you may have heard of the terminology. It's as simple as saying that you can't round trip the money from Indian founders into a US company or a Singapore company and then have that money come back into an India subsidiary. And as we discussed earlier, the US company will need to fund the India operation. So the money sitting in India or in the US or invested into the US company will need to come back into India for the operations in India. You can't do that if you have originally invested or the founders have bought shares or transferred any money from their Indian accounts to the US. We have to carefully structure that if you're India-based founders, and we have created different models depending on what your personal situation is, what the investor preference is. But the most common one is called the gifting. So you would hire someone or bring on a nominee in the US, preferably a relative, who would buy your shares or on your behalf. Buy the shares, we would set up the structure, and once everything's set up, then they would transfer the shares to the India founders. So that's a very easy and clean way of doing it. There are other options also depending on what your investor requirements or your personal requirements are. There are some, you will hear about POEM issues, place of effective management, but those don't apply to early stage companies with less than 50 crores in gross revenue. So you don't have to worry about those kind of issues initially. As you build the business and this, investors come in, you're building the business, it's certainly useful for one of the founders at least, or some of the management team, to think about moving, physically relocating to the US. And US immigration laws are not that bad. I mean, everyone's heard about, US immigration. It takes time, but if you have a credible business and a structure, legal structure that supports that, and investors, it's not complicated to get an H1 or O1 or L1, some sort of a structure that allows you to relocate physically to the US. Under the Biden administration, I fully expect that we were actually working with the Obama administration at the very end of the Obama administration on what they call the founder visa. And because of the last minute, rush on other priorities, the Healthcare Act and all that, we were not able to get that passed. So the Obama administration was not able to get it passed. But again, I've been re-engaged with a very strong group of other people who are lobbying for it. And Biden administration has given clear signals that they will be very supportive of the founder's visa. Founder's visa, if it's passed, will be very simple. If you're a founder of a non-US founder of a company set up in the US, and if you've raised some threshold, I think it's 250,000, but the rules will clarify. If you raise $250,000 or more, you can actually process a 3-year visa, and that can be extended, or a 1-year visa that can be extended up to 3 years. So you can very easily, I mean, if you're raising 250,000 from credible investor, which is any other angel investor, lots of angel investors running around in Silicon Valley, or VC investors, obviously, you will have a very strong shot of being able to get a visa that allows you to live in the US and build that company. And as you raise more money or build the business, really create jobs in the US, you'll have the ability to continue to extend that, and in the long run, sort of go through your green card process, if that's your personal decision to do so. But in any case, you'll have the ability to come in and out and stay and relocate to US very easily, even easier than what it is right now. We talked about the other structures. One other structure that's emerging very rapidly is where founders sitting in India have this sort of dilemma that they want to structure. So hopefully you when you go back tonight, you'll start calling me or emailing me and saying we need to start setting up the US structure. But you might run into an issue where your initial investor, seed investor, even a larger investor in the future are India registered funds. And Sanjay can speak to that obviously, and we work with Let's Venture very closely on these structures. But you may have India angels or India VC funds that are not, for regulatory reasons, the way they are structured for different reasons, they're not able to invest in US companies. So we've also created a parallel investment structure, and we did that for one of our clients 5 years ago, and we didn't know where it would go. We just did it as sort of a desperation, because we wanted the client wanted to take the money from the US, and they had good strategic investor in India that wanted to bring it in. And that structure has now emerged as a very leading structure for these situations where you have India investors that need to invest but can't invest in US. And this does require more careful thought, and I wouldn't just throw it out there, but I would we do need to talk to the India investors, understand, because it's a very new structure. The investors may not be, even US investors, not familiar with this, so it will require some careful sort of presentation, answering questions. So I wouldn't want founders to go around and try to be experts and try to, because you might end up confusing either your India investors or US investors. But the simple structure is that we create the same model and we have US investors. And this is a structure where, let's say, you are raising money in the US and you have some strategic or key investors in India that want to and only can invest in India companies. So you would actually set up the same structure. US or global investors would invest in the US company, and India investors would invest in the India company. In exchange for that, because they can't get shares in the US company, instead of getting shares, they will invest in India, and they'll have the right that at any time, if the regulatory sort of options allow them in the future, if they're applying for SEBI approval, for example, and that comes in 3 months, or for whatever reasons they are able to do it in the future, they would have the right to require that the US company buy out their shares in exchange for paying them an amount equal to the value of their shares, or issuing equal number of shares in the US company. So let's say, if they were to invest, so if we step back, and it's a very creative model, it's very simple and it works really well. It's amazing how from 5 years ago when we didn't know what we were doing to now, lots of major firms and companies are raising significant amount of money, are using this structure. But it's simple in the sense that if the investors were investing $100 in the US and were going to get 100 shares in the US, and they're not able to invest in US, we have them invest that $100 in the India company, and whatever shares they get, they have the right to sell those shares to the US company in exchange for 100 shares in the US company, or the right that if the US company is being sold, then the US company will buy out their India shares and pay them equal to whatever the 100 shares would have got in that exit. So it's sort of best of both worlds. They don't have to buy shares in the US, so they're not running afoul of any regulatory issues, but they're getting all the economic rights, and we could also do we could also structure some contractual rights as if they had invested in the US. So this structure is emerging, and if you have investors that can't invest in US, but you want to bring them in, and there's a US investment happening in parallel, this would be a very good structure to think about. As we've discussed, the third option is that investors invest directly in the India Private Limited. All of the structure is in the India. The good thing is that it's perfect for consumer facing, where the public, the markets are India, the potential exits are India, but it's not as so you'll see the advantages of one line item, disadvantages of all of those, and I've shared those already, so I don't want to belabor the point, but it's a good structure if you're the Shadi.com or Flipkart or large e-commerce or other consumer facing business where the customers are likely to be always in India or mostly be India. We've talked about Singapore. It's a good option. Again, if you're looking for accessing Asia-based funds, your market is Singapore, Indonesia, wherever else the markets are. But you could continue to be an India company. The same regulatory issues, the same flipping issues apply to Singapore as they apply to US. So that doesn't help you much, except by being Singapore company, you're not really doing yourself any favors because you're not able to access global capital. US investors will not invest in Singapore. You will not set up for an exit. And that's what I challenge founders all the time. Tell me about, or, go and find out the companies that have become Singapore successful, being Indian founders setting up successful Singapore companies that have gone on to raise large amounts of money and or gone out to successfully exit to large technology companies. Because the buyer, at the end of the day, the exit will still happen in the US. So if you're a Singapore company, if investors are investing in Singapore company, at some point you decide to exit in US, it'll still be a sort of nightmare dealing with tax structures, which is why investors, US investors, don't want to invest in Singapore because they know the exit will happen and they will be stuck with the tax implications. And you founders will be stuck with the tax implications. Cayman parent company, all I will say is I just put it on the slides just to show everyone that I know about it. If you hear about it, don't think I don't know about it, we'd miss it. It's the sort of option of the least, resort. If you have no other options, you want all sorts of, if you're completely confused, this is the right option for you. It's just that if you're not able to make decisions, but you need to raise money, but mostly not from Indian investors, not from US, but let's say from Dubai, China, other places where the investors may be wary of investing in US because they have to go through diligence, or investing in India because of tax and all those issues. They might require to be a Cayman. And again, if that's all what it takes to raise money and become successful, sure, consider it. But let's very carefully think about the consequences, and you'll have to sort of live with that, being a Cayman company, and what are the day-to-day operational risks, tax issues, and how all of that will play out into an exit. So let's discuss that before you sign up for a Cayman parent company. That's all I have on terms of presentation. Hopefully, I didn't go over my time, Divyansh, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Anil. It was a really insightful session. So, time for some of the questions. So, uh, I have Rajul here. He has one or two questions for you. Rajul, can you please unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. So is SPAC not possible for India incorporated companies? Number one. Number two, we are a tech company and looking to flip in next few months. But we are a near profitable company. So we are also looking at an IPO as a possible route of 3-4 years down the line. And if you're looking at an IPO, does it make more, where do we get more value for a profitable company, tech company, in India or in US?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess nobody has anything in the US against profitable companies. Rajul, you'll have to mute yourself. Yeah, thank you. So just because you're profitable doesn't mean US is not attractive or US investors will not be attractive, right? The only thing you have to consider is that US investors don't worry about you not being profitable as long as there's a big TAM, there's a big market access, you are doing what you need to do, which is capture the market, technology working. You have all the other sort of elements. Then US investors, unlike most other investors, don't care as much, are not worried about you not being profitable. Again, don't turn that around to think that because you're profitable, US investors will have a problem with it. Yeah. Right. So that's the first part, right? I mean, US will still be a bigger market for you, right? An IPO, the capital the numbers are completely, outstanding and staggering when you compare that to any other market from an IPO perspective. And SPAC is not an option. SPAC will require disclosures, tax disclosures, tax structuring, compliances. All of that has to be a US, mostly a Delaware corporation that you'll merge into, or you'll need to be as going into a SPAC. I don't know what your second question was, but I think, again, if you are a pre-IPO, if you are a revenue generating company, and in 3 years you're thinking about a pre-IPO, hopefully one of the elements you will walk away with after this presentation, I would have done my job, is realizing that now's the time for you to make a decision, because as you continue to build that profit, you continue to make it more complicated. It's still doable at any stage, but it's just the earlier you get into it, the faster, the better it is for you, the less issues for you, your investors in the future, And obviously we'll have to think about how your contracts are, where the IP is, various things, but you need to make a decision fairly quickly before you get on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very clear. If one has to do it as early as possible.
Thanks, Raju. Anil, we'll take one more question for now before we move on to Sanjay's session. So we have Venkat here. Venkat, can you please unmute yourself and ask?
Thanks, Divyansh. Hi, Anil. My question is, let's say if I'm setting up an e-com company in Canada for the Canadian market, would it make sense to have a Delaware parent?
I wasn't clear. Is it purely for Canadian market or also including Canadian market?
It's purely for Canadian market.
Well, I mean, I don't know how you're so sure it's purely for Canadian market, but I will leave that for you. If you are sure it's for purely Canadian market, then there's no reason for you to be Delaware, right? I mean, investors in US are not really excited about Canadian markets, right? I mean, and maybe they are. I mean, in the sense that they will still. So the short of it is, get a Canadian company. Canada does have a lot of incentives for tax, and it's much easier to migrate into Canada, especially if you're building and creating jobs in Canada. So if your market, if somehow you know that your market will be Canada and your exit will be Canada, you should be a Canadian company.
Thank you, Venkat. Thank you, Anil. Anil will take up few of the questions later on. And now we'll move on to the session with Sanjay, where we'll talk about equity management from different locations because just incorporating US is not going to stop at that in terms of business operations. Another aspect of it, how do you really manage your equity effectively being in different locations? So stages for you, Sanjay. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Divyansh. So hello, everyone, and thanks, Anil, for the insightful presentation and discussion. I guess a lot of questions are pending for you, so stay on, and I will try to wrap this up quickly as I can so that all those questions for our audience gets answered. Right. So my startup equity is a product of Let's Venture. Some of you might know it. It's a cap table and stock options management. Right. We work. I mean, it serves for Indian companies, Indian startups, Singapore, US, all of that. So today's session, I will primarily deal with or talk about how this product can help you when you flip your company to US and how it makes it easier for you to manage all your cap table data, stock options, and all that. So what is equity management? First and foremost, in terms of stock options, you manage your pool and you do grants to employees. All this happens digitally. You can have different kinds of vesting schedules, managing exercise that is done by the employees, buybacks, repurchase, all those things. 409 evaluations that you need every time you do a grant. Everything can be managed through our My Startup Equity product. On the other hand, on the cap table side, managing all the shareholder records, managing the share certificates. I forgot to point that out. There is we support both uncertificated shares as well as digital share certificates for US. Managing all the funding rounds, evaluations, all the documents that go with all the fundings that you raise, so that it is single place for capturing all of that. Convertible securities, you raise money in safe, and tomorrow you want to convert those whenever the next round of funding happens. All those can be easily managed through our product. Makes life so very easy for founders. And sometimes we have Inventors Law as partners. So if if you are working with Inventors Law as a legal partner, they can in turn use My Startup Equity to manage all these for you. So, okay, other than stock options, what are stock options first of all, right? I mean, these are options that, give employees a right to buy the shares of a company, right, at a certain price. So that is the option. These are not actually shares of the company, right? So I hope that part is clear. There are other incentive mechanisms which are equity linked that are also, popular or rather common in US. One of them being RSAs, is restricted stock awards that can be given to co-founders, employees, your advisors, and so on. There is a phantom stock, which is a cash-based incentive mechanism, which is internally linked to the equity, but typically they are given as cash incentives. At the end of the day, employees are going to walk out with cash equivalent to the rise in the stock price rather than getting the shares, which is the case in stock options. ISO and NSO are two different kinds of stock options. ISO is applicable for US residents, has some tax benefits. If you are giving stock options, like Anil was saying, from a US holding company to your Indian employees, you should be giving NSOs, right? And of course, for Indian residents, they have to pay tax according to the Indian tax rates and tax laws. I guess, why should founders grant ESOPs? I usually dwell on this in more detail, but for now, I'll keep it brief. Of course, I believe that ESOPs are a very powerful tool available to founders to incentivize, to attract, to, reward and retain top employees. And you should, of course, plan for it. You should do it judiciously, and you should, preferably use a tool like My Startup Equity, where everything becomes transparent and easy and so on, right? So what do you do if you have to, roll out ESOPs in your company, right? First and foremost, you need to get a ESOP plan done, usually done by a lawyer. So Anil's firms would do that for you, right? If you are raising a round, then, usually the pool size is something that you need to provide in the shareholder agreement itself. That is quite common. Once this is prepared, you need to get the stock option plan approved by the board and the shareholders, and then you are ready to roll out grant letters. In US, one very important thing to note is that every time you do a stock option grant, you have to get a 409 evaluation certificate, right? Of course, there is a caveat to that. If you only have India employees, then you can skip the 409A part, and you can continue giving grants to India employees without needing a 409A. For your annual tax filing and P&Ls, you need to get an expense statement for all your ESOP grants, and we provide that through our tool. So even if you are a US registered company, you can go to our expense report and just download everything, and it happens in a click. These are some of the questions I get from founders, which I will leave it to you. If you have any thoughts around this or questions around this, we can take it up during Q&A. The top questions being, what should be the ideal size of my pool? What is the typical vesting schedule? Do I need to have, a uniform vesting schedule, or is a backloaded vesting schedule okay? Is the exercise price, what it should be? Of course, in US, it has to be as per your 409A, so that is kind of resolved. How many ESOPs should I give, right? So that is a very kind of $1 million question, right? I can throw some light on you if somebody has that specific question. Who should I grant ESOPs to? That is a very founder philosophy kind of question. Do you give it to everybody? Do you give it to only top employees? Do you give it to high performers? All those things you can think about. When employees leave your company, what is the time period you allow them to exercise, right? So that is a important question. What are the different transfer restrictions and all those things? I'm sure Anil would be able to spend and give you much more insights on this, but I can share my thoughts on how I have seen different founders handle it, and what are the best practices that are emerging from the Indian point of view. These are some of the real life problems I have seen founders face when they try to manage things in Excel, right? Of course, most of the companies we start talking to, they are currently managing their stuff in Excel, and we see that it poses a lot of problems, right? Especially with respect to, let's talk about grant letters. We talked to a company where all these grant letters were being managed on paper, and when there was a time for a DD for a new round of investment, they found the letters were missing. So they were kind of going back and forth trying to get those backdated grant letters in place, right? Another company I talked to, their share certificates had different numbers, and their cap table Excel sheet had different numbers, right? And they spent a lot of time trying to kind of reconcile the two. So all these problems go away when you have a product like My Startup Equity to give you a single source of truth, right? And also, not to mention the last part where there are the company I talked to where the employees were kind of kind of arguing or with the company that, hey, I have so many vested options, but you have given me only, you are telling me only these many, right? All that is because, you know, the way currently it happens on paper, it is not very transparent, while you know, product like My Startup Equity makes it very transparent for your employees to see what is the current value, to see how many vested options they have, and so on, right? So these are some of the, you know, in detail I have laid out, you know, how the how your life could be without, you know, a product like My Startup Equity. And with My Startup Equity, I have talked about some of the things already, so I will probably tell you one or two things that I didn't talk about. One is, of course, we do something called ESOP liquidity, where let us say tomorrow, or let's say your company becomes valuable and you want to do ESOP liquidity for your employees, where employees can actually cash out some of the ESOPs. We do support that as well. We actually bring in investors to, you know, get that ESOP liquidity done for you, right? We provide you a 409 valuation at a fixed price and at an affordable price. That becomes very helpful. And rest of the things that we can, you know, you have it here. These are some of our customers. So a lot of we have over 260 customers from India, Singapore, and US. You know, many Series B customers, unicorns. You can see some of the logos like Delivery, Wildcraft, PharmEasy, and so on. I'll skip these two slides, as you know, I have covered most of these. These are, you know, very in detail what are the various features that the product provides. Of course, you know, it helps not only, it helps all the stakeholders. So on one side, it helps the internal stakeholders, the founders, the CHROs, you know, and you know, finance heads. On the other hand, it also helps the shareholders, that is your investors, as well as the employees, get a consistent, transparent view of all the data regarding CapTable. Now, overall, you know, many of you know Let's Venture as a funding platform. Yes, we do that, and we are very good in that. But you know, we have now number of other things, including My Startup Equity, which is a CapTable ESOP management. We also have something called Let's Venture Plus, where we bring in money or investments for growth stage startups and unicorn startups, where you know, family offices and large ultra HNIs, they write larger checks, and to help with either, you know, participating in a primary round of funding, or you know, something like ESOP liquidity program that we can create for you, and we can bring in all this money to, you know, buy out ESOPs from the employees. So overall, if you look at Let's Venture, we are slowly growing towards a stage where we can serve you from idea stage all the way to IPO stage, right? So I'll leave you with that thought. And these are my contacts, contact at mystartupequity.com and website. You can access us anytime, and we'll help you answer any of the questions you have. So that's it, Divyansh.
Thank you, Sanjay. That was a great session on equity management. Now we'll move back to the Q&A session. So Anil, we have some more questions for you. Next, we have Pradeep, who wants to ask you a couple of questions.
Hi. So yeah, I was based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was managing finance for a Kleiner Perkins-led medical device company. So I'm broadly aware of the challenges and the value you bring to the table as far as addressing these issues early on, and its significant cascading effects on costs. So my question is, now I'm planning to set up a coaching practice based out of the US, typically for US CEOs, CEOs in Canada and Europe. So I want to, and I'm currently based in India. So what would be the most simple and, you know, cost-effective and compliant structure that I could set up? You know, I don't want to, you know, I want to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, and I assume that, you know, you're not looking to raise money in this structure, right? I mean, this is
No.
not a structure. Yes. So,
no, I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very different structure. You're not worried about bringing money, the round tripping issues that we would think about.
Right.
I would still recommend that you think about, you know, buying the equity in the US company. Well, you could create a US company that is a subsidiary of the India company. You're not looking for, you know, any outside investments. You're not looking for issuing options or stock in that US company. You can just
Right.
create a US company that's 100% owned by the India company. And the
Okay.
India company can then fund that as an equity investment, and the US company, when it gets revenues, can transfer that money to India in that structure. Because you're a services, professional services company, not a venture-backed company that'll be raising money from outside.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there should be a one-man LLC that I could set up in the US?
You'll have to talk to a tax advisor. We're not qualified to give tax advice, but LLC might be a good idea. Because it's a flow-through entity, so you don't, the LLC, the legal entity, doesn't pay any taxes. Now, keep in mind, if you create an LLC in the US, and I can't give tax advice, but if you create an LLC in US, the IRS would basically discard that entity, right? That's the whole point, that the LLC will not be just like an LLC or LLP in India. There's no tax payable by the entity. The risk there is, depending on the numbers and everything else and the operations, the risk is that the IRS would say we are discarding the LLC, so we will tax the ultimate shareholder, which is the India company. So you could subject your India operations to tax in the US. So I would say sit down and put tax advice to be sure.
Got it, got it. So it will not serve as a separate legal entity as far as tax purposes concerned.
Right. So creating a C Corp similar to what a private limited company is would be better from a tax perspective.
Got it, got it. And in terms of visas and stuff for working in the US, what would be the best way to work it on in case I need to travel?
Yeah, again, talk to an immigration lawyer, but you have different options, right? I think in your case, the L1 would probably be the best, where it's an intra company. Once you set up the US company, within, you need to have been working with one of the companies at least for a year and have enough money in the US. If you're just traveling, then H1, right? Sorry, if you're just traveling in and out, then H1. If you're looking to relocate physically, then the US company will need to sponsor your L1. And for that, you need to have raised money in the US company to show that the US company can pay for your sort of whatever the expense and cost and prevailing wages that you have to be paid for.
Got it, got it. Thank you so much, Anil. And what is the best way to reach you, Anil?
Anil at inventorslaw.com, and it's on LinkedIn everywhere else, right? I mean, if you just Google it, I think you'll be able to find me.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much, Anil. Truly appreciate it.
Next, we have Arpita here, who has a couple of questions for you.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. My question is, if as an Indian private limited company, I want to make investments in shares of a US-based company, what is better? Is it better to invest from the Indian company or set up a US company and then take the shares of the investing companies in the US company? Both from a tax perspective and a compliance perspective.
You have to, ask your Indian advisors, right? It's all driven by Indian. The US doesn't care how you come in, right? The question is, Indian company, are there restrictions on investment in the US, right? If there are restrictions or tax implications for investing, those will all be subject to your Indian tax advisor will have to advise you on that.
Okay, understood.
Thanks, Arpita. Sanjay, there is one question for you, and that question is regarding product capability. So I have promoted Raptor. Can you please go ahead and ask your question?
So Sanjay, on the product side, do you have, it allows for management of advisory shares and all as well on the cap table?
Yes, any kind of shares. Of course, the advisory shares are also issued like normal shares. It can be issued for non-cash consideration also. So we do allow for that. And you could do the same thing for India or US registered company.
And also, how does a subscription work post 100 grants?
Yeah, so we do have up to 100 employees, it is free annual subscription. And like you said, post 100 employees, we charge 1,000 rupees per employee per year.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Sanjay.
Next, we have Vijay. Anil, he has a question for you.
Yeah, hi, Anil. I was particularly interested with this consumer tech, India-focused, India customers. Can it be an Indian parent with a subsidiary in Delaware?
Sure. I mean, again, you don't even need a subsidiary in Delaware, right, for that purpose. Again, the question is, are the investors in India or US? If they're in US,
obviously we will have US investors. So, what happens? I mean, I saw your presentation where you were saying Delaware as your parent and India as a subsidiary. What happens if there's a reverse way where it's an India subsidiary with India parent with a Delaware subsidiary? Well, I mean, I didn't see that point of view. How does that help actually?
It does not. That's why I didn't have it on the slide. I did have on the slide an Indian parent, right? If you are creating a company in India for the Indian business, then you don't need a Delaware company, right? So there are investors that might say, okay, create a Delaware company, will invest in Delaware, but keep in mind, they're investing in a Delaware company that is a shell company, right? If you are operating the business in India, the IP is in India, your founder stock, everything is in India, almost always, right? You're setting up for an exit in India, right? So if I'm an investor and I have shares in the US company, which is a subsidiary of India, India is being sold to a buyer, don't get an exit, right? So as an investor, that's not an attractive structure for me.
Yeah, but only thing what I was thinking is if you're a consumer tech company with India, it's not just India, but it also can go to Asia, right? So when you have an expansion program, then I think it is better that what you had suggested as a structure, parent in Delaware and subsidiary in India, right?
All I'm saying is that if you're setting up an India-focused business, then you don't need a Delaware company, right? Delaware doesn't help.
Right.
That's all.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Anil. Thanks.
Next, we have Aditya. You can please unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. It was a very nice presentation, first of all. And my question is on global capital. So you had a point that it's easy to get global capital, which and you meant VCs and private equities. So can you also brief on debt by working capital financing? Like if we have a Delaware company, how easy it is to get this financing and what is the process, and a slight idea on interest cost?
Yeah, so again, that has nothing to do with the structuring issue we're discussing, right? You're just saying because, again, if you're an India company, you can't access debt from non-India sources, right? Or if you do, there's some debt equity ratios and various regulatory issues that will come in. So if you are looking to raise debt from outside India, then in any case, you have to think about creating a structure outside India that can support the debt coming into that legal entity, right? What is the process? I mean, it's not easy to get debt for a startup. Debt, and then we work with a lot of the typical sort of venture debt investors, but they typically invest on top of venture capital, right? So if you're raising a Series A round, or if you raise a Series A round or Series B round, the debt guys will come in on top of that. So they'll say, okay, we'll invest. If you're raising 5 million, maybe they'll give you a loan facility or a receivable financing for $500,000, and they'll get a small piece of equity, as a warrant. But it's very hard, as close as impossible, without saying impossible, for a startup with no outside venture money to be able to raise venture debt. Unless, again, if you are a different business, if you're a cash-rich business, if you have gas stations or you're providing services and there's cash coming in and you want to finance that cash, that's easy, right? You can do receivable factoring, receivable financing. But if you're a tech company with IP only and no outside credible VC investors, it's very difficult to take debt into that structure.
Yeah. So possibly not just venture debt, but possibly through banks, debt financing, working capital financing, anything like that.
So yes, working capital finance is available if the numbers match, right? So I mean, then again, if you have a US company, set up US holding company, the customers are putting money into the US company, then you can go to it like any other business in the US. You can access that debt financing. And obviously, interest rates in US are surprisingly low, right? So if you compare them to India,
okay.
So all I'm saying is that's like any other business that they would evaluate, right? But it will be more of not tech business, not IP, but driven on your customers and revenues.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Anil. Thank you, Sanjay, for taking out time to advise our ecosystem on equity management and getting incorporated in the US.
Yeah, thank you, Divyansh. And I just want to leave sort of with one thought, what Sanjay mentioned earlier. A lot of you will ask, okay, why do I need to do this? Well, the fact that you're here on this conference on a Saturday morning where you could be doing other things, shows that you understand at least that this is a useful topic. The fact that, you should I just want to emphasize that your equity, as you build the equity, understanding what that is, protecting that equity, understanding where you are in the cap table, making sure the documentation, all of that is done properly is important. It's not just important, it's critical, because that's all you have, right? At the end of the day, you're putting all of your heart, soul, your work into it, your life's work into it to build a company in order to get an exit. The exit will all depend on your equity, right? That number on the stock certificate, on the ledger, or on my startup equity cap table. that's what the whole value, that represents the entire value you're creating, right? You could be creating the value out in the outside world, but if the equity structure and documentation is not clean, you have nothing to show for it. So that's how critical it is when you build the company.
Thanks a lot, Anil, and appreciate your time on a Friday night for you. I guess I will talk to you separately about our own new entity that we are creating and how we could potentially have a US structure to that. So I think thanks for sharing those nice thoughts and ideas.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone.